Good evening, everyone. My name is Faisal Galaria. A few weeks ago, Imran asked me to come to this event and speak. So it's been a busy few weeks. So I want to start by with an apology. I don't have slides that I'm going to show. I'm going to break a few rules by asking that if you do have any questions, you jump right in. And I don't have a speech that's been pre-prepared with like the other speakers. So I've got a few ideas and I'm going to speak from. So if you do have any idea, if there's anything you do want to ask, please do jump in. When Imran asked me to come to this event, part of the reason why we were talking was I just left Spotify. I left Spotify on May the 31st, and we were reflecting on the last few years, and that's where the title comes from: disruption, scale, and underdogs. And part of the reason why it starts with disruption was because a few weeks ago there was an article that a journalist wrote about me saying, for someone who's been so disruptive, Faisal had a very, very normal and unremarkable childhood. That childhood and that upbringing was actually started a few miles from here. I was born in St Luke's Hospital in Bradford, just up the road, and for the first 17 years lived within a few miles of this building. So, in terms of the rest of the title, scale and underdogs, that refers to a little bit about what's happened since being born in St Luke's Hospital in Bradford. I hesitate to say this given some of the other speakers that we've had today, but it could be said that underdog could refer to being born and starting life here in Bradford. It doesn't. Before I get a good kick in, and the disruption could refer to some of the first work that I did after university in Croatia, following the Dayton agreements of December 1995. But I'm not going to speak to you about the Dayton agreements. I'm not going to speak to you about Croatia. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about what I've done in work, and I'm going to start with a quote that some of you may be familiar with. A million isn't cool. You know what is cool? A billion. And the reason why I use that quote is I've been very, very lucky over the last few years to work with some of the most important and disruptive, scalable, and underdog companies that we've created here in Europe, starting with Cluster Consulting, Skype, Kayak, which is the world's largest travel meta search engine, and most recently Spotify. So I started life as a strategy consultant. There's no one asking any questions, and I did say, if you do have questions, jump in. So this is going to be a very short speech otherwise. I started life as a strategy consultant with Arthur Anderson and moved for a couple of years to an outfit called Cluster Consulting. Cluster Consulting was started in the 1990s out of Spain, and I helped open up the London office in 2000. We were sold a little while later for just shy of $1 billion at $930 million. That's $1 billion company number one. A couple of years later, I was at Ofcom, which is the Converged Telecoms and Media Regulator that I joined after my MBA. I joined working for Ed Richards, who was at the time the Telecoms and Media specialist and advisor to Tony Blair. He wrote much of the Communications Act, which resulted in the creation of Ofcom. And when I was finishing my MBA, he asked me to join Ofcom as his strategist, and I wrote part of the Communications Act. So I wrote part of the Telecom Strategy Review, which was mandated by the Communications Act of 2003. Whilst at Ofcom, as part of the policy executive, those of you who remember back to 2002, 2003, 2004 will remember that voice over IP was in its genesis. So there were companies like Vonage and Skype starting to make their presence felt. And at Ofcom, we had to make a decision about how to regulate these new voice over IP companies, these companies that provided what looked like telecommunications, regular telecommunications, be it landline communications or mobile phone communications, but actually operated more like email. And you can imagine that an organisation with like Ofcom that was largely staffed by people from the regulators had actually no idea of what voice over IP was or how to regulate it. And so I got to make a recommendation in 2004 to the rest of the Ofcom that what we should do is forbear from regulation for the next 5 years, which was exactly what the FCC in the United States had mandated just a few months previously. And as a result, someone called Nicholas Stenstrom was very, very happy. Nicholas Stenstrom was the CEO and founder of Skype. At the time, Skype was about 12 people big, and I got a phone call saying, we really like the decision not to regulate voice over IP, and would you like to come and join? So, $1 million company number 2. I joined Skype first of all as well, it was 12 people, right? So I was number 13. So, like in any startup, you do everything from opening the door, making the tea, thinking great thoughts about how this little software company would disrupt the telecommunications industry, and that it actually now accounts for about 12% of all voice minutes across the planet. And then after Skype, I did a couple of things. I was actually moved to San Francisco as part of the merger integration with eBay. Did my own thing in San Francisco for a little while. Joined Kayak, and then most recently, as I say Spotify. So if you look at what I've done, it started in strategy consulting, goes to voice over IP, spans search because Kayak is the world's largest travel search engine, and most recently online music. And when I sit back and think, how did it all happen? Is there a common thread? I actually think there's a very strong common thread throughout all of those experiences. If there's anything that you take away from this, those of you who are interested in technology and building companies, it should be this. It all starts with a great product. If you build a great product that delights the end user, you'll get virality. People will tell each other, the company will grow. A great product essentially needs to be kept really, really simple. So if you think back to Skype, those of you that have used it, it actually paired back right to its very simple. The most simplest parts of what MSN was doing beforehand, or Yahoo was doing beforehand, to make calling over the internet really, really simple. Even Net2Phone, who were pretty big at the time, struggled with adding more and more features, but Skype was just really, really simple.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
When a new technology comes out that threatens existing technologies,
Yeah.
I mean, when I first heard about Skype, free calls anywhere in the world, the first reaction of the established companies is to try and crush any innovation in these emerging companies. So what was your experience of how they reacted to you and how you managed to avoid being crushed?
You could have been planted because part of the very last thing I wanted to talk about is actually, has anyone heard of Clayton Christensen? Yeah, all right, spot the academic at the back. Clayton Christensen is an academic at Harvard Business School who became famous through writing a book called The Innovator's Dilemma. He postulates that you can predict innovation that's going to be disruptive and actually going to take over the incumbents by looking at products and services that have become too complex, that have become overly grand or overly overly complex and overly expensive for the vast majority of users. And that if you can pare that back and actually focus on delivering that bit of value that customers really, really want, and provide that at a price point that is significantly cheaper than the all singing or dancing version, then actually you create a new market for that product or service, which serves a much, much bigger audience. And that's exactly what Skype did. It's what Kayak did in terms of making search really easy. It's what Apple does in terms of paring back and thinking about simplicity. So the postulation is that by thinking about what features and what's really important to the customers and pricing that at a new cheaper price point, you open up the product or service to a massive audience. And in terms of what did the big telcos do when we started at Skype? Well, first of all, they didn't even see us coming, because we were this weird little software company based out of Tallinn, and that's fine actually. The less they knew about us, the better, because they didn't see us coming. It was only when we actually started really taking market share that they started worrying about us. But even right to the end, they thought this is far too clunky, far too weird. Putting headsets on and calling over the internet, it's far too weird. What they didn't appreciate was that for the first time in history, we've made phone calling independent of the amount of time that you called for or the distance that you called for, and that's why it's disruptive. And they didn't see it coming. Anything else? Any more? Any other questions?
Could you define an underdog company? Like, what is it that, I mean, obviously you can understand what an underdog is generally, but are there particular traits you think, or particular markets where underdogs can be successful?
I think you find these underdogs all over the place. Essentially, the way that I think of an underdog company is a company that, in fact, Nicholas Sedstrom says it better than I would. Nicholas says it's not the big that beats the small, it's the fast that beats the slow. So it's the agility, it's the innovation, it's the hunger, it's the better design that makes an underdog. And essentially, partly in answer to your question, it's the ability to move quicker and react to customers and understand what customers want and continue to delight customers and make that the focus that makes an underdog win. So I talked about product being the number one determinant of building a billion-dollar company. Business model innovation, equally important. We're seeing innovation in business models all the time. I've been particularly associated with freemium business models. That is where you gain a massive audience by providing something for free or very little. In the case of Spotify, you can listen to music for free, and if you want to put it on your mobile phone or you want to put it onto a device, then you pay. But at Skype, it's very similar. So only 7% of people across the planet, that's 650 million people who use Skype, but only 7% of people who ever pay for Skype. It's a whole new business model. Google works in much the same way. The majority of people who use Google, in fact most people will never click on anything other than the search that they're looking for. But actually 2 to 3% of those searches result in a click on the right hand rail, which means that Google gets paid. So there's lots of business model innovations. It could be freemium, it could be advertising, which you pay with your time. Increasingly we're seeing subscription as a new business model. But the one that people don't talk about is sometimes it just doesn't matter what your business model is because you're going to sell the company first. And then the last key learning, I guess, if you've got to get the product right, and actually that's the most important. Focus on the product, focus on the business model. But the last one is make sure no one sees you coming. Because if no one sees you coming, they can't prepare, and they can't prepare for what comes next. So at Skype and at Spotify, it wasn't until, in fact, so Spotify took 2.5 years of stealth development before we came to market. So 2.5 years of development. It wasn't until the product was ready, that it was there, where it was ready to be unleashed, that it came into the market. And in fact, for those 2.5 years, no one talked about Skype. Outside the company, no one talked about it.
Given we've seen in this country to move into a new regulatory regime where new internet protocols and services will have to go past the regulator first, what impact is likely on underdog and disruptive companies which want to start in the UK if we do move to that regulatory environment, which should obviously by this next year?
I'm not sure that we'll end up in a situation where startups will have to go and get permission to start up.
It's the protocol bit of the Information Commissioner. They now say they have, under the European Directive, enough powers to put new protocols in and take existing protocols away from the internet, which I think is quite a huge leap for me as a protocol implementer.
No, as far as I'm concerned, anything which hinders innovation is going to be really damaging, and we don't do enough to promote innovation, let alone getting in the way of innovation. So it's not going to happen. So make sure no one sees you coming. Keep humble and hire the very best people. So what I've tended to do is hire people from company to company. And you can't build companies based upon hiring your friends, but it's a good first place to start. And that's kind of what I had to say. So